Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Today I'm going to cover two of the Theban Plays by Sophocles, Oedipus the King and Oedipus at Colonus. I read a few different translations of this work, and I'll highlight that in a bit. This is book 14 from my great books reading list of over 200 of the great books. Well, Sophocles is the second of the great Greek tragedy writers, and I do need to make a quick comment on that word writer, because as Bernard Knox points out in a note at the end of his version, his and Robert Fagles' edition of the three Theban Plays, he makes this comment: "He was not, in the modern sense, a writer. The official inscription commemorating the winner of the dramatic competition for the year 447 BC, for example, says Sophocles was the teacher. He taught his chorus their songs and his actors their lines. Like Shakespeare, he was a playwright, not a writer, but a maker of plays, author, composer, choreographer, and director all in one." End quote. And I like that. That helped break out a little bit more of what Sophocles was. And we're talking about the great books here, so I like to think of an author or a writer, but Sophocles was much more than that. And he wrote in his lifetime over 120 plays. We only have 7 of them that have survived, but he was a prolific writer, and he lived many years. This work, the Theban Plays, they're usually paired together, or there's 3 of them that are placed together. And so the 2 that I'm talking about today about Oedipus, so you've got Oedipus the King, Oedipus at Colonus, and then Antigone. But they're not a trilogy in the sense that Aeschylus's Oresteia is a trilogy. And so these works can be they're not performed together like Aeschylus's Oresteia is, and they're actually written in reverse story chronological order. So Sophocles wrote Antigone first, but Antigone is actually in the storyline, that would be the last play. So you have a continuity of characters and storyline and all that, but they're not considered a trilogy. It is a tragedy, and as I've highlighted in the last couple of weeks, a tragedy is really an impossible situation. And what you have in Sophocles' works is a kind of a step further, where there is a fate, there is a prophecy, there is something that is bound to happen. And that is part of the tragedy. The people in the play are trying to bypass fate. They're trying to not be a part of what has been prophesied, but they're stuck in that. You can't get outside of fate. You can't get outside of these prophecies, and that's part of the tragedy. And so I guess as I'm reading more of these tragedies, I'm getting a better understanding of what that all means. But yeah, just in its essence, a tragedy is kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Just really hard choices. Oedipus is a mythical king of Thebes. And so let me just give kind of some brief overviews of these 2 stories. So in Oedipus the King, it starts with a plague. And so Oedipus is the king of Thebes, and outside of the castle walls, people are dying. There's this plague going on. So as Oedipus the King tries to find out what's going on, he hears about a prophecy that says he must drive out the corruption that is in the land in order to stop this plague. And so, being a good king, he tries to find out what is going on and what is causing this. And the other part of that prophecy is that he must banish or kill the man who killed the king. So there was a king before Oedipus. That king was killed. And so it's Oedipus's job to find out who killed that king, banish or kill that person, and then the plague will go away. And so this is a story of a man with chaos going on around him, who through the course of this play realizes that he is the reason for the plague. And I'll leave it at that. It's such a unbelievably memorable story that you have to read this for yourself. You've probably heard the storyline in your life. It's very, very famous, but yeah, that tragedy of discovering what is the problem in realizing it points back to you? That's Oedipus the King. Oedipus of Colonus takes place several years after Oedipus the King. And as a side note, Colonus is the birthplace of Sophocles. And so in this play, Oedipus at the beginning is told that he's told that if he will be a blessing upon his death, in the place that he is buried, there will be a blessing in that area in the sense of warfare. If war happens in that area, the place that houses the body, they will be victorious. And so there's this interesting thing is the whole Oedipus the King is how this cursed man ends up being a curse to his city, and how there's a plague because of him. And now you've got this shift where as Oedipus reaches the end of his life, he has the potential to be a blessing. And this is fated by the gods. And so there's kind of this shift that takes place within this play. I don't want to give away too many other details in the hopes that you will, if you haven't read them, that you will read them. So I'll close both of them with that and then just get into some other items here. So I want to talk a little bit about Sophocles. He lived to be 90 years old. So he was born in 497 BC and died in 406 BC, and give or take a year on each of those numbers, as the exact years are not known. The age that he wrote, or the year that he wrote each of these plays, were the following. So 442 BC for Antigone, either 429 or 420 BC for Oedipus the King, so somewhere within that range, and then 406, like the very end of his life, for Oedipus at Colonus. And then Oedipus at Colonus was first performed in 401 BC in Athens. Sophocles was a contemporary of Aeschylus and Euripides, so the two other tragedy writers, which I just find utterly fascinating, that we have four, the great four tragedy writers are these three Greeks and then Shakespeare. So that's the company, and three of them lived at the same time. That's just phenomenal. But something that really made me smile was that Sophocles was also a friend of Herodotus. And I read Herodotus's histories last year, and just I absolutely loved them. And so just the idea of Herodotus and Sophocles being friends, having discussions, like, to be a fly in the wall of those discussions, that must have been incredible. Sophocles was also one of 9 generals with Pericles, who was a leader of Athens, and he was a general for putting down a revolt in Samos in 441 BC. And as I highlighted in a previous episode, Sophocles was credited with creating the third actor. So you started off with a chorus. The chorus would kind of tell the story, and then Thespis introduced the first actor. And so now you can have someone kind of perhaps narrating the story along with the chorus. So the chorus doesn't disappear, but you've added this one actor who can, tell, maybe give a different side of the story or do different things. Aeschylus is credited with creating the second actor or utilizing the second actor. Now you can have dialogue and along with the chorus. And then Sophocles is credited with the third actor. So now you can have debate, a lot more things going on along with the chorus as well. As for themes in these two plays, you have the city versus the family. So what takes precedent, the family or the polis? And this shows up quite strongly in Antigone as well. You have submission versus opposition to fate. So there are fates that are put forward, and they're usually put forward through prophecy. So prophecy is not just like a guess of what is going to happen, but prophecy is viewed as being from the gods, and it'll usually come through a spokesperson. And so they might go get an oracle from Apollo, and then that prophecy, this is what is going to happen. And no matter how much that prophecy is disbelieved or fought against, or people attempting to flee areas so that they're not even around where the prophecy is going to take place, the prophecy ends up being fulfilled. And so you see different characters. Do they submit themselves to that prophecy, or do they oppose that prophecy? In Oedipus at Colonus especially, you have this this theme of guilt versus shame. And so Oedipus the King, just the worst possible things you can imagine for somebody to be a part of. And in Oedipus at Colonus, you see Oedipus grappling with that. And the moral guilt, he didn't know what he was doing, and that's his response. And so on the moral guilt side of things, he feels that he's in a good place. He's okay, but there's still the shame that's associated with it, in societal shame, personal shame, and so you've got those themes going on as well. Last one that shows up quite a bit is just blindness versus sight, and so you have blind seers. Oedipus is blind after a period, and so just people are talking about having sight even though they're blind, or being blind. Oh man, just so many good things going on with these themes. So if you're about to read these plays, or these are just like some helpful themes to kind of go in with and just kind of see them battle each other. I read 3 different versions of these plays. So again, I'm going a little bit overboard, but I really want to know these plays well. And so I'm getting different translations because I find just seeing a different translation really helps. And then the other thing with the different translations is there's usually a different introduction in each of those books. So I as much as I can, I'll try by just reading the play, and then I'll go back to the introductions. But I've read these different versions and then the introductions as well, just to really get a grasp of what is going on here and see different viewpoints and that sort of thing. So the first version I did was the David Grene translation, and this is the Everyman's Library hardcover edition. This is a nerdy thing to say, but this is my favorite version to hold and to read, because it's just it's a beautiful hardcover. I love the Everyman's Library ones. Just the size and everything is great. So I loved that, and that's what I started off with. I also joined a Catherine project, which they do online reading groups, and so I perfect timing, got in one that covered Sophocles, and so I've been doing that over the last few weeks. And the version suggested for that was the Peter Manick and Paul Woodruff version in translation. And so one of those guys is a playwright, so he kind of brought that into the introduction and sort of and how would these have been presented. And then the other person was a translator. I believe they both were translators, but one was also this playwright that just gave a lot of extra fantastic information about how these would have been presented. And then the last one I did was the Robert Fagles, Bernard Knox translation / notes. And they are the power duo. I love everything they've done that I've read. I used their version for Aeschylus as well, and I've read their Aeneid, and I'm going to be reading their Iliad version soon. But Bernard Knox does a lot of the introductions and notes, and then Robert Fagles does the translations. And if they have a version for what you're reading, pretty good chance that that's going to be a good one. So I read each play 3 times. So the David Grene version I just read straight through, and so I read the introduction and then I read the 3 plays, and then I did the individual plays in Woodruff first, and then I would go to Fagles. So I would read the Bernard Knox intro and then the play. And the reason I did them separately is at that point I was in that Catherine project, and we were covering 1 play per week. So I would read as much as I could about that play before the discussion. As for the reading order, there's kind of a battle of, what order should you read these in? I read them in this order: Oedipus the King, Oedipus at Colonus, and then Antigone. Many people say that you should read Antigone first, then Oedipus the King, and then Oedipus at Colonus, because that's the chronology of when Sophocles actually wrote them. It's not the story chronology, but it's the chronology of when Sophocles wrote them from first to last. Antigone being the first, and then Oedipus at Colonus being the last. And the reason that people say to read it that way is you get to see how Sophocles grew in his craft. And you also just get different pieces of the story. So it's kind of a fun way. I saw someone connect this to Narnia and the different order that you can read Narnia. And so the correct way with Narnia is not necessarily the chronological way, but it's a way that you discover the story as you're reading. And if you go the other way, it just kind of takes some of the magic out of it. So whichever way you want to read it, I read it probably what many consider to be the wrong way, but I didn't know the story that well, so I actually found it helpful to read Oedipus the King first, then Oedipus of Colonus, and then Antigone last, because that's how the storyline for that actually goes. For the rest of this episode, there'll be 2 more segments. I'm going to cover 4 things in the next segment that stuck out to me, and then in segment 3, I end with my one thing, the one thing that I'm still thinking about after having read Sophocles. All right, here are 4 things that I thought were really neat in Sophocles in these 2 works. So the first is prophecy, just the existence of prophecy in these plays and what it meant. So this play is really a commentary on prophecy, Oedipus the King. And so I want to read a part from the introduction to Oedipus the King. So this would be the Bernard Knox introduction. Sophocles was dealing with matters that had urgent contemporary significance. Prophecy was one of the great controversial questions of the day. It was in fact the key question, for the rationalist critique of the whole archaic religious tradition had concentrated its fire on this particular sector. Far more than prophecy was involved, for if the case for divine foreknowledge could be successfully demolished, the whole traditional religious edifice went down with it. If the gods did not know the future, they did not know any more than man. These are exactly the issues of the Sophoclean play." End quote. So he then goes on to talk about how different characters address prophecy. So Jocasta, she dismisses it, and so you see how different people approach prophecy and respond to it. And so it's just a neat thing. But I really liked that. In the different plays and in the Iliad and the Odyssey, you see this going to Delphi and going to these oracles and obtaining these oracles. And so what Knox is saying here is that whole thing was coming into question. Like, do the gods really know the future? And if they don't, then they don't know any more than man. So why should we listen to them? And if they don't know any more than man, then are there even gods? So like there's this is the question being addressed here. And I just thought that was fascinating because prophecy plays such a big part in these plays. And so you can track that throughout these plays, but to know that this was a larger question than that. It wasn't just an issue of, it was actually being discussed at that time. So I thought that was really neat. One other thing that came up here, and so this is item number 2 in this section, is just the Greek word for curse. And I learned what this is. It's aura. And so the Greek word for curse is that, but it's the same word for prayer. And so a curse is just a prayer for someone that harm would be done to that person. And I posted this on Twitter because I thought it was really interesting. And a man named Raymond Bonwell responded and said, it's the same thing for Hebrew. And so there's a word, barak, B-A-R-A-K, and it means both a blessing and a curse, and it's derived by the context that it's in. And so that appears to be what is happening here with the Greek. I mentioned that just because it was helpful for me. If you've listened to previous episodes, the curse is something that I talk about a lot. It's just something that I'm fascinated with. Like, it brings up questions of who can do a curse. What does a curse mean? Does it only come from gods? Does it follow you the whole rest of your life? Or is it something that can be done away with? And so just this idea that the same word is used for a curse or a prayer, and it just depends on what the prayer is actually for, that determines the context of it. It was helpful to me. It helped me to understand that idea a little bit more because curses show up over and over in these plays. Third thing here is just this idea of blessing through suffering. and that there is some sort of a hope in all of this mess. And so there are some similarities here just with the story of Job, the book of Job in the Hebrew Bible, but just, I guess it offered some hope. You're reading a tragedy, you're reading about just awful things, and yet at the end of the Oedipus at Colonus, there is a blessing for this man who has suffered so much. The fourth thing here I want to highlight is just this idea of words and actions, and this is something that shows up quite a bit in Aeschylus, where in action being kind of on the side of force. And so does might make right? If you're able to win a battle, if you're able to just destroy the person in front of you, is that the way to go? Does that make society? Does that make civilization? Or is the act of deliberation, the use of words, is that what brings forth civilization? And so you see this very strongly in the Orestia, in the final play there by Aeschylus in Eumenides, where these Furies become kindly ones and lead in a different direction. And so I'm kind of tracking this just because it was such a strong thing in Aeschylus. And so it was amazing to see how it showed up here, because you just at the base level, you've got kind of force versus words. And so words versus actions. But in the Colonus play, you've got Polynus, his son, Oedipus's son, come and use deceitful words. So words, obviously, but words can be used in a way to try to get somebody to do something you'd want. That would be bad for them. And so in that sense, that's almost like the might makes right. They're using words in a way to drive a bad outcome. And so there was just all these kind of plays on these ideas. You had Antigone with her father in Oedipus at Colonus, and she's quiet. There's like this quiet action of obedience to her father, to her family. And you contrast that with these deceitful words of her brother. And I really got into that. I loved kind of tracking these things and just seeing how words and action could be used in all these different ways. So those are four things that really stuck out to me in these two works by Sophocles. In the next segment, I'll get into the one thing that I've still been thinking, or that I'm still thinking about after reading these two plays. In the Catherine Project group that I'm a part of, one of the questions that was asked was, why do you think this play has been popular for nearly 2,500 years? Aristotle cited it as the most brilliant example of theatrical plot and the model for all others to follow, according to Bernard Knox. And so I've been thinking about that question a lot. Why is this still popular? Why is Sophocles one of the four great tragedy writers, and especially Oedipus the King being one of the best examples of theatrical plot ever? Why? It's such a disturbing play. I read it in I don't know if you guys get the same way, but you just cringe at what's happening. And so it's not a pleasant thing. You're seeing a man find out just that everything going wrong around him is because of him. And I think that hits on why this is so popular. You're able to have a sort of a distance from watching a man's life implode. And I think it just hits on one of our deepest fears, one of my deepest fears, and it's exactly that you see chaos around you, you see things falling apart with your family, with society, with everything going on, and everything begins to start to point back to you. Like, that has to be the most horrible thing that can happen. It's the ultimate tragedy. You're not the victim of anything. You're actually the perpetrator. You're the reason for these things. And so when I was reading Oedipus the King, three stories kept coming to mind. And one of those is I'm sure you're aware of this this story, but when doctors first began to realize or were told that they were killing their patients because they weren't washing their hands, and there was big disbelief at this, how could things be on my hand that I transferred to other people, but for the doctors that got it and realized that had been the case, that must have been such a tremendously awful realization. Like, how do you go home? How do you look at the mirror at night knowing that you had done that because you hadn't been washing your hands? And so the very thing you were trying to do of save lives and help people, you were actually killing some of these people. That's the first thing that came to mind. The second is just that story of G.K. Chesterton, where the newspaper asked, what's wrong with the world? And he replied back with, I am. And then the third thing that comes to mind is the story of David in the Bible, where he has committed the sin with Bathsheba. He has killed Bathsheba's husband, and Nathan, the prophet, comes to him, tells him a story, and David says, that's awful. And Nathan says to him, you are that man. And in the Oedipus the King, there's a seer who says, you are the corruption, you are the pollution, you are the curse. And just that realization, I think one of the reasons this has stood the test of time is because it hits one of our deepest fears, that we hope that's never the case with us. We hope that the things inside of us are not causing the chaos around us, but to come to the realization at points that is the case, it's a hard thing to grasp. And so that's the thing I've been thinking about a lot after this play is that idea. One thing I also like, just kind of a side note here in this last segment, is in the Odyssey, there are a ton of recognition scenes, and that's a big part of the Odyssey. People don't recognize Odysseus, or he goes to a new land and he doesn't share who he actually is. And then obviously at the end of the story of being recognized finally by the suitors and by his family, there's just these series of recognition scenes, but it's always about other people finally recognizing Odysseus. But in this play, that's kind of flipped on its head, and I think that's part of the brilliance of this play and of Sophocles, is that the recognition scene in this one is about the person himself. And so it's the man, it's the king here who is seeking to find the pollution in his land, and the recognition is that the pollution is him. He's the pollution. He's the problem. And so Sophocles flipping that recognition scene is just brilliant. So to recap, talk about Aeschylus and tie Aeschylus into this as well. In those episodes about the plays and tragedies by Aeschylus, I shared that I really struggled with them. I had to read them many times, and just to get the story, it took a while. And I think part of that was just the tragedy play in general. I had to kind of get in the mindset of that. I'd come from the Iliad, I'd come from these epics, and now I'm getting into these tragedies. It just took a while to understand, how does this work? What's the role of the chorus? What is the role of these people? How does this all work together? And so I think battling through Aeschylus has helped me with Sophocles here, to where I was able to understand these Sophoclean plays and to enjoy them right off the bat. And so each subsequent reading, I would get more and more out of them, but it wasn't as much of a struggle as I had with Aeschylus. If I were to suggest one version, it would be the Robert Fagles and Bernard Knox translation and introduction and notes. I love that duo, and I think they did a great job with this one. So if you just need one to start with, I would start with that. So coming up here, I want to highlight three different things I'm going to read or in relation to Sophocles here. Actually four other things. So the first is a play by, I'm going to butcher this, but Jean Anaïl, and he wrote a play, Antigone, that was performed in the 1940s in France. So while they are under occupation by the Nazis, this play was put on. And he did it in such a brilliant way that both French and German audiences of the play liked it, but he was addressing things in society. And so I bought it's the play, but then there's a commentary on it as well. So after I finished reading all of the versions of Antigone for my last class of the Catherine Project, I'll read that one. After that, I'm going to read a book by Bernard Knox that partner with Robert Fagles, and this one's called Oedipus at Thebes: Sophocles' Tragic Hero and His Time. So I'm hoping this one just kind of gives me an insight into Greece at that time and Sophocles as part of that. And then I'm going to read the other plays by Sophocles. So that'll be the final thing. The fourth book I have on this list is, it's called An Oresteia, and it's translated by Anne Carson. So she takes one work by each of the tragedy writers. So Agamemnon by Aeschylus, Electra by Sophocles, and then Orestes by Euripides. And she has a translation and an introduction as well. I really liked Anne Carson's translation of Sappho. And so this one was suggested to me on Twitter, and I bought it. And so I'll close out with this. I may wait to read this one until I finish Euripides, and then I'll just read this one that has one work from each of those I can't call them writers, remember, but each of these playwrights. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I would love to hear from you if you've read any of these plays by Sophocles. If you got something else out of these that I failed to mention, or something I got wrong, I really would love to hear from you. So you can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com, or just comment on this podcast page. So I've moved the podcast over to Substack now. And so that allows me to just kind of keep content coming and keep these pages updated. And it also allows me to seek some funding for this podcast. So you can either be a free subscriber and get everything just as you would if you were a paid subscriber, but I'm viewing the paid as just a way for you to support the podcast. So I have ways to support at a $9 per month level, a $99 per year level, or a $999 founding member. So whatever floats your boat there, if you would like to support the podcast, I would be very grateful. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, and you can go to the website or to this Substack page to learn more about the project. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out. Oh, and one last quick note, I will be covering Antigone in next week's podcast episode. Adios.